Well, earlier this month, the federal government introduced legislation that would ban children under 16 from using social media in Canada unless a platform can demonstrate it has sufficient safeguards in place to protect young users. The proposal was inspired in part by Australia, which became the first country in the world to put in place an under 16 social media ban last year. But now Australia says it's already having to double down in its fight with social media giants to make that ban work. The country's internet regulator is investigating several platforms for non-compliance amid concerns that children are still accessing those platforms months after the ban took effect. And today, the Australian government moved to strengthen its enforcement powers, with the country's prime minister saying tech companies simply aren't doing enough to comply. So what lessons does Australia's experience hold for Canada, and what changes, if any, is the Carney government considering as a result? Marc Miller is the Minister of Canadian Culture and Identity, and he joins me now in studio. Mr. Miller, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
So as I was mentioning, Australia's internet regulator is now looking at 5 companies, so Meta's Facebook and Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and Google's YouTube. The government says these companies are deliberately failing to comply with the law, using, quote, dirty tricks to undermine the ban. What kind of pause does that give you as your government prepares to deal with these very same companies?
Look, I didn't have a ton of confidence to begin with. As you mentioned in introduction, we have a feature in the law that allows companies to demonstrate to us that they are safe by design, whether you're an AI chatbot provider or social media platform. Confidence level not very high, but the onus is on companies to demonstrate that, or they would not have access to kids under 15 or 15 and under. The study that came out a month ago in Australia, limited in the scope and dealt with a short period of time about what was working and not working. It showed that kids that had access prior still have access. So that's alarming. It only studied a little less than 900 people, so preliminary in nature, but it does give pause. What it didn't show is the number of people that have been prevented from accessing social media, and so that is an important factor in determining whether there is initial success or the challenges that are being identified. But we knew it would never be perfect. But to situate this for Canada, we're catching up to places like Australia and our peers that we compare ourselves favorably to, France, Germany, UK, and they've had years of reducing the harms on the internet or in social media. And kids in those countries have demonstrably better experiences. So we kind of need to get there. And we also need to put in place a ban that will be effective. And that will be the task of legislators and the committees that will study it. But we'll look at options as they come up through the legislative process. As you mentioned, this was introduced just as Parliament lifted. So I'm going around the country talking to groups that have been fighting for this for years, and glad to entertain any sort of review or amendments by parliamentarians.
Mm-hmm. You seem to suggest that your confidence level in these companies was not very high to begin with, but I know you did say earlier this month you had spoken with many of these platforms about what the law might look like, and I'll just quote you here. The reactions, to be quite frank, have been anywhere ranging from frankly cautiously optimistic to neutral. That's speaking about the company's reaction. So how do you explain that Australia is having such a hard time working with these companies, whereas they seem to be apparently not very bothered by what Canada has put forward? What does that say about what you're proposing?
So it wasn't a question of being bothered or not bothered by it. I think they're still studying the law that we put forward, and they think they can work with us on it, and how that work relationship evolves is to be determined. And if the experience with Australia is any indication, so confidence level doesn't necessarily skyrocket. But we will have a regulator that will have to work with companies to make sure that they are, one, complying with the law. The law is important to respect, or else there will be significant fines. But also make sure that in the architecture of these social media platforms, there's a back and forth and a compliance process that reflects that relationship. And obviously, being a new law in Australia with respect to the moratorium, and in other countries, certainly I can see some hiccups. But I think you can't just stand there and hold your breath and hope people will comply with the law. That's why we propose a regulator that will have enough support and bodies to be able to interact with social media platforms to make sure that they are complying. Reactions were neutral in the sense that they wanted to be able to examine the law, and also in some of the discussions that we had, they thought they could demonstrate to us that things could be safe, whether we're talking about YouTube Kids, still have to demonstrate that they are safe by design. But there are options to making sure that the kids have a demonstrably better experience online than they do today.
You mentioned the fines. Australia announced over the weekend that it would be doubling the maximum penalties up to the equivalent of 95 million Canadian dollars. Your legislation would actually allow it to kind of peg it to the global revenues of those companies, so 3% administrative penalties and then 5% for criminal fines. So potentially much stiffer penalties. But I think the question then becomes one of enforcement. And so how is it that the regulator could actually enforce those penalties and actually go recoup it from these foreign-owned entities?
Well, I guess two things. These are companies that do recognize revenues in Canada. If they want to do business in Canada, they have to be subject to our regulation, hard stop. There is a mature body of law that recognize enforcement of jurisdictional fines from countries of a similar nature. So that is something that has existed for a long time. So if I were to go and seize assets of someone doing business in Canada based on a fine that they incurred here, that is relatively easy to do with a proper enforcement system, assuming they're operating in a country that has reciprocal agreements with Canada.
I also want to touch on your intervention recently in a decision by the CRTC, so Canada's telecommunications regulator. The Commission had ruled that foreign-owned streamers would have to triple the contribution they make to produce Canadian content, up from 5% of their Canadian revenues to 15%. Your government asked the CRTC to review that decision, and at the same time you announced $600 million to support Canadian cultural industries. And I should note, in the interest of transparency, that the government also said that funding envelope could be used to support services of exceptional importance, such as CPAC. You justify the decision, that intervention, by saying that that would actually add the costs to the streamers, who then pass it on to consumers, and now is not the time to make life more unaffordable for Canadians. But you're now effectively instead putting up $600 million of taxpayers' money. So aren't you just yourself raising the cost to Canadians instead of passing, presumably leading the companies to do it?
Well, I think a couple things, and you could parse this any which way. We know that there were significant concerns about increased potential production costs in Canada, and demonstrable proof that people with 2 or 3, 4 or 5 subscriptions could see their annual payments go up by $40. Whether that happens or not, I can't speculate, but that was a concern. The decision also reflects my impatience, the Prime Minister's impatience, to make sure that cultural industries are getting properly supported. It's no secret to anyone that's looked at the CRTC decisions and the implementation of the law that the CRTC is implementing, that there were court cases ad nauseum that were in no particular point of being resolved, and therefore the cultural industries, audiovisual industry, suffering in Canada like it has been for a long time for a variety of reasons, but including streamers not paying their fair share, needs money. So I think it's important to take a pause and ask ourselves, what do you do as a government when you know that you need to support Canadian content, Canadian culture, and those that are producing it? And do you ask them to wait for 2 or 3 years until this all gets resolved? Or do you say to yourself, well, this is a system that needs some tweaking, and the CRTC needs to be a part of it? There's no point at which the CRTC should, it is an important regulatory body, but should be the ultimate decision maker. And I think the decision reflects practicality of the Prime Minister, practicality of this government to actually get stuff out the door and to get support into the industry that heaven knows needs it.
Right, but that was the whole point of the increase, right? From tripling it from 5 to 15 was to support those companies and support Canadian cultural producers. France requires foreign-owned streamers to invest between 20 and 25% of local revenues into domestic film and TV production. Italy requires 16%. Germany is looking for 8%. Why does your government think 15% is too high?
Look, I think, and you listeners are at a disadvantage because I have not issued the directive to the CRTC. This is not an expectation that people will pay nothing. Not to put myself in the shoes of the streamers, heaven forbid, but there was a sense that the streamers would fight this to the very bitter end by refusing to fund a third-party fund that would then potentially fund themselves competitors. It wasn't necessarily a suggestion that they didn't want to invest in Canadian content. So there is a balance there, and I, as we are in the process of developing what the directive will look like in its specificity. I can't tell you what that will be yet, or whether it will be acceptable to large streamers. People do need to pay their fair share. The spirit behind the Online Streaming Act is one that is laudable. The question is one of balance and getting it right in an industry that is in constant transformation.
And just very quickly, I'll close on this, because we have heard from the chair of the Canadian Media Producers Association. He said that the $600 million your government is offering is far less than would have been raised had this proposal by the CRTC gone ahead. So how do you respond to critics who say that your government is shortchanging effectively, Canada's cultural sector in the face of pressure from the United States?
Well, one, it's inaccurate. The assumptions are just that. They are assumptions based on the entire obligations being removed. And the reality is the 600 does more than what we anticipated some of the hits would be. Look, you can disagree on this, and I think there's some frustration because of the uncertainty that is prevalent in the industry. But this is a government that wants to get the money out now, wants to make sure that people are getting the support they need to make sure that Canadian content continues to be created, and that we achieve a balance that makes sense in the context of a very, very difficult relationship with our southern neighbour.
Marc Miller, we'll need to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.